So thank you, Lisa, and thank you for the Battery Intervention Task Force for giving me a chance to address you here today. I must say that you should know that I spent the night at the Houston airport, sleeping on the couches there, keeping company to the cleaning crew. And so if I sound a little sometimes or wobbly, more than usual, forgive me and ask me to repeat. Now you have heard so far, here an echo. Do you hear an echo?
A little bit of an echo.
You have heard so far both from, and I missed the earlier presentation, so my apologies for that. There was also a delay this morning in the flight coming in. But you heard this morning presentations, or this afternoon, by Larry Bennett and by Ed Gondel, both of who kind of like present to you more of a kind of like a methodological critique of the studies and the literature on the effectiveness of intervention with men who batter. What you're going to hear from me has a lot of echoes for what they say, but also hopefully will add something different, because my approach to this over the last several years has not been so much to speak about the methodological shortcomings as it has been to kind of like contextualize what we know and the context in which we're really making sense of the data that we're collecting about programs that work with men who batter. As you heard before, I'm now the new provost at the Albizu University in Miami. Albizu, just for those of you, I'm sure you haven't heard it, but we're on the move. It's the first school of professional psychology in the United States. We were established 50 years ago. And a few years ago, we were recognized by the National Science Foundation as one of the top 5 producers of Latino PhDs in mental health in the U.S. So it's a little good secret that we have in Miami going, and we're trying to grow it right now. Now, before doing that, and that's relevant to the talk today, I was the Associate Dean for Research and the Director of the Community and Educational Wellbeing Research Center at the University of Miami. And in that role, a lot of what I did was kind of like work to try to match the talent and resources and interests of faculty and students with the needs and aspirations of community organizations that were trying to promote the well-being of our community. So I was in a different role as that of most researchers. I was creating university-community partnerships to promote the well-being of our communities. My approach to this situation and this topic of domestic violence is similar. I see myself, and over the last 10 years or so, has evolved my role as being more of a catalytic agent. I kind of like I'm one of those academics who is on the ground with the boots on the ground folks, all the way up to kind of like the Washington folks who are doing and making decisions and asking for input. I sit with the researchers at their conferences and so on. So, but I no longer doing the type of hands-on research I have in recent years that Ed and Larry were presenting earlier today. I do use their work quite a lot, as you will see. All right, now some of you when you get this, you'll see a lot of the references for some of the topics that were mentioned by Gondel and Larry are listed here, and the relevant sources that I also inform my talk. So when you get this, somebody ask about the Cochrane and all that, you'll get all the references there if you wish to read more about it. Now what I want to do today is to kind of like make a case for a contextualized and systemic perspective in evaluating the effectiveness of interventions with men who batter, particularly programs for male perpetrators. And we'll talk some about the evidence that has been accumulated over the years, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about what a more comprehensive and dynamic systemic response to domestic violence may look like. Some of the things may repeat, but actually for some of the things that I'm going to say, you probably, previous talks were like, got the sponge wet, so you might now get it when you hear the third time. Right? Let me give you the take-home message to begin with. From my perspective, in my review of the literature, conventional battery intervention programs operate with grossly inappropriate community and government support. And even while they operate in this context, these programs are key contributors to behavioral change and victim safety, as the research suggests. The programs are part of social policies and systems of interventions and should be evaluated that way. Not to do so is really a big mistake. To really isolate them and evaluate them, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of these programs, to evaluate them as the same way that you would as any other biomedical intervention, as Gondo has said before, is really a mistake, because it simplifies the issue, it reduces the issue, and eliminates necessary complexity that needs to be there in order for us to understand what works and what is not working. A coordinated response is needed to increase the effectiveness of programs and risk management. And as you heard from both Larry and Ed, a core group of unresponsive men warrant more intensive and extensive intervention. A point that they had not made, and I'd like to make, is that judicial leadership is a key component to promote behavioral change and victim safety. And I worked over the last several years at the benefit of working with the National Council on Juvenile and Family Court Judges, participating in the training of judges on issues having to do with domestic violence, custody, maltreatment, and so on. And I come to see the value of this it's a very important component. I don't know exactly how much of a role they play here in the state of New Mexico, but it's something that we'll talk about. Now, any here familiar with PolyFact? You know what this is? So go check it out later. This is a website where political candidates make statements about facts, things, and then they go and check them out. So what we're going to do today, it's kind of like go through some of this in the same way that you would if you were reading it on their webpage. The Truthometer has several kind of like dimensions, going from true, the statement is accurate and there's nothing significant missing, to pants on fire, the statement is not accurate and make a ridiculous claim.
Donald Trump's hair is real.
And right, so if we had Donald Trump here, we would have a different conversation about it. All right, the first one, let's look at the personal context of battery intervention programs. Most people believe that battery intervention programs are so important for the safety and well-being of women and children in their communities that they will be willing to set aside 1 to 5% of their monthly income to support the proper functioning of BAPs in their communities.
False.
Pants on fire? Anybody? Pants on fire, right? Exactly, pants on fires. Now, this, you may laugh and it seems funny, right? But this is really important because there are no constituents. There's no core group of people who are out there advocating for better services, more resources. There are no protests down in front of the legislature's chambers asking for more services and more support for these programs. And you have to keep this in mind as we move forward. Relational context. Most partners in intimate relationships experience low to moderate levels of distress. Most partners in the United States, let's say in New Mexico, experience low to moderate levels of distress.
True.
You've just seen this presentation before. I thought, oh, we'll see. I don't know. I don't know the answer right now. All right. So we have a true. Anybody else?
Mostly true.
Mostly true. All right. So the research on distress in intimate relationships goes something like this. We know that the majority of adults really want to get married. We know that about half of these marriages end in divorce. We know that approximately 25% of the couples divorces within 3 years of their first marriage, and that approximately 80% will try it again, and 60% to try again and in divorce again. Bad news for those of you who are trying. Right. Now we know if you look at the issue of violence, we know that about 13% of all marriages in the United States report some form of physical violence between husbands and wives. We know that approximately 15 million women have experienced violence in their marriages, and that about 5 million women have been chronically and severely abused by their husbands. We also know when you look at younger couples that the rates of violence in dating relationships range from 9 to 69%. So intimate relationships at a very young age are really problematic. And that and we know that about 40% of newly married couples report verbal aggression against their partners. And why is that important? Because verbal aggression is an important predictor of physical aggression down the line. So what is then the answer? It's mostly false. Most partners in intimate relationship do not really experience low to moderate levels of distress. They experience a great deal of distress in their relationship. The majority of people in our lives, the couples that we live with, the couples that live in our neighborhood, the people that we hang out at work, are really going through a significant amount of distress in their life. And you, again, need to keep this in mind when you set up your expectations for the effectiveness of interventions with men who batter. Social context. The levels of economic inequality at the national and state levels have a weak relationship to individual health and social problems. What do you think? Pants on fire. Okay. Anybody else has a different answer? All right. Now, if you're not familiar with it, I recommend you go take a look at Wilkinson and Pickett's work on one of the volumes called The Spirit Level, but they have a fantastic website where they basically go in and do two different types of analysis. They look at the Gini index, kind of like an index of inequality between the wealth of the top 20% of the population and the wealth of the bottom 20% of the population. They did it by countries, in industrialized countries, and they did it by states in the United States. I don't have the data here. This I pulled from their website, but the same data that I'm presenting to you now at the international level, they have for states in the US, including New Mexico. And when you look at the work that they've done, you see that the higher the level of inequality, the higher the level of all sorts of social problems, including life expectancy, math and literacy problems, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, obesity, mental illness, and social mobility. Countries that have greater levels of inequality, like the US, have higher rates of all those problems than countries with less levels of inequality. When you look at homicide rates, which is more relevant to us in the context of domestic violence, you see a similar pattern, not as steep as the other, but a similar pattern. Although you hear in the US, we take the cake again. Our higher levels of inequality lead us to be one of the most homicide-prone, although not the most country in the world. When you look, for example, at drug use, and you can also see the data suggests that the drug use is more common in more unequal countries. Again, the USA takes the gold. So we win the Olympics on inequality and the effects on the toxic effects on our communities. When you look at the prevalence of mental illness, you also notice that it's higher in more unequal rich countries. And once again, we take the gold. So we are definitely the gold standard when it comes to inequality and its effects on our communities. Okay? Now, so the answer to the question, the levels of such economic inequality at the national and state levels have a weak relationship to individual health and social problems, is clearly false. I don't know if it's pants or fire, okay, but it's clearly false. We can, again, and you need to keep it in mind, we have a set of programs that have nobody backing them up or deciding that they are really worth investment in a meaningful way as part of our life. You have a context of intimate relationship filled with distress and a lot of opportunities for aggression. And you have a social context that is really stacking the odds specifically against those who are most vulnerable, those folks who have less resources in our communities. And you need to keep this in mind when you're thinking about the effectiveness of interventions with men who batter. So there are large numbers of people who are having, as I mentioned just now, very difficult time sustaining harmonious relationships and honoring their commitment to their loved ones. To me, the amount of distress, you can read it here, and violence in intimate relationships, and the impact of inequality in the well-being of societies suggests that there are really important contextual and systemic forces at play that we need to keep in mind. If you go ahead and evaluate, if you go ahead and crunch the numbers, if you go ahead and devoid from that contextual, meaningful information, go ahead and do these evaluations of programs without considering these contextual markers and determinants, you end up with information that is very difficult to make sense of, because it does not reflect the lived experience of the people that you are evaluating. Obviously, the programs that we provide services to are not immune to these forces. Now, another polyfact check. Our elected officials are committed to preventing violence and promoting the conditions under which harmonious, intimate relationships can flourish.
We're on a national level here?
At a national level, yeah. I'm not presenting data from your state, but on a national level, would you say that elected officials are committed to preventing violence and promoting the conditions under which harmonious, intimate relationships can flourish? If that was the case, how much of the budget for social services you think will go into prevention and wellness promotion initiatives? What do you think? If they're really committed to this, they're experts on return on investment here. What would really justify that? What would, take a guess? Would it be 20%? Would it be 50%? Would it be 10%? So when you look at the allocation of financial resources on the Department of Health and Human Services on issues of on the well-being of our nation, you come up with a number similar to this. This work is done by some community psychologists, and the reference I don't have here in that list, but I'd be happy to submit it to you. Isa Priletensky, Dean of the School of Education and Human Development, talks about this issue, and it's important. So you can really see here that between 1 and 3% of the budget allocation goes into what we will call wellness promotion and prevention, and most of it goes into remedial treatment. So the statement that they're really committed to preventing violence and promoting the conditions under which harmonious relationships can flourish is mostly false. And again, that is important because we know that we don't really care much about them. We know that that relationships are difficult and people have a lot of distress in them. We know that they live in unequal environments and that there are really a lot of toxic conditions affecting their lives. So if we don't pay attention intentionally to promoting the well-being, are we really setting ourselves up for failure? Are we really then, when we expect, what are we expecting for better intervention programs to do? Okay? Now, when it comes to domestic violence, I'd like you to contemplate the idea, who's responsible for advancing the social conditions of justice needed for our individual, relational, and community well-being? Okay? Who's responsible? Is it government officials, the criminal justice system, shelters for battered women, battered intervention programs, state coalitions, researchers, nonprofit organizations? And over the years, I had kind of come to believe that in the absence of a clearly articulated systemic response to DV, and given the fact that domestic violence continues to be a very serious problem in our communities, we end up really blaming intervention programs for men who batter for our collective failure to act on this issue. We end up really having such high expectations of them because it is easy to believe, as judges did earlier when we first criminalized domestic violence, that this was the pill, that this was going to resolve the issue. And to me, again, is a it shadows the fact that we collectively have failed to protect women and children from the violence perpetrated by men. So let me tell you a little bit about how we got here, for those of you who are not that familiar with the social context and perhaps the historical context of the field, because it was not always that case. When we started working with men who batter, intervention programs were part of a social movement, and that's how they were framed. Programs like Emerge and others in the late 70s and early 80s saw themselves as part of a social movement. They included volunteer men. They were slow, experiencing slow growth. They conceived themselves as part of an emerging systemic response to DV. It was a grassroots effort to change norms, to change the way in which we conceive gender issues, to try to look at socioeconomic factors that were affecting the life of these men. And they were guided primarily by commitments to justice, equity, egalitarianism, and social change. These folks who were working at that time needed that there were important social forces at play, and they were willing to take a leadership role to try to address them. Now, when we moved into the 90s, there was a strange marriage between the feminist, the battered women advocates, and Republican legislators, led to fast criminalization of domestic violence. It became, we succeeded in rightfully, I must say, making it a crime. With the consequence, though, that changed the whole terms of the debate. And the criminalization led to an explosion in programs for men who batter without appropriate knowledge base to do so. We did not really know what worked. And all of a sudden, we went from a handful of programs in the 80s to over 1,400 in the 90s. And without an appropriate knowledge base. Okay? That led to favoring the adoption of structured curriculum based on behaviorally oriented programs over other alternatives. Some eventually became known as the Duluth model, and others like that, who actually, they were just trying to systematize what they were doing so that at least people could follow a set of guidelines. Now, the expansion of services, which was dramatic, led to also came along with a high expectation for success, as defined by the criminal justice system in terms of the number of men served, the cost of services, and recidivism rates. And the whole conversation and the commitments to social justice, gender equity, and social change really became secondary. We stopped really talking about that. We moved into the 2000s into the evidence-based conversation. Violence continued to be reprehensibly high. Even though domestic violence, even though the rates of violent crimes were going down and the number of privatized prisons were going up, a lot of stuff was going on during the 2000s. We have the whole phenomenon of the mass incarceration of black and brown men in full force. So during this time, there was a push to apply a biomedical criteria, an experimental methodology to the evaluation of bad intervention programs, which is what you asked Ed about, and it became the basis of a lot of the meta-analysis. We began to think that, and to define evidence in terms of randomized assignment of participants to groups and reliance on meta-analysis as a convenient bottom line verdict on programs and policies, as Ed said. The 2010s, in this last decade, has seen a predictable expansion on the efforts by mental health professionals and psychologists in particular into what they perceive to be a new market for services. And this is not new. Psychologists have done this with any condition that comes up. After a while, if the issue is there and the need is there and they can define it in ways that only psychologists can deal with it, then they will do so and create a market for themselves. So all these efforts to look at very specifically anger management and specific cognitive behavioral interventions and attachment theory, all this, the importation or the exportation of psychological treatments into the field of domestic violence has behind it a very strong kind of like a familiar core of practices in the field of psychology. Now, in this process, we have had a lot more conversation about, how to turn intervention with perpetrators of intimate partner abuse into forms of therapy. And in fact, there is often a lot of confusion in how people refer now to this. A lot of people, when they talk about these programs, easily transfer or use the language of therapy, when in fact it's not therapy, and it's not meant to be therapy. So time for another truth check. Scientists agree that evidence-based means that evidence is generated through randomized clinical trials. And Charles, you alluded to this before. You thought this is what good policymaking does, right? That this is what we based on this. The assumption is, that scientists agree on this. But do they? What do you think? Actually, it's if I'm asking you, give you an idea. But do they? Okay? Now, what does evidence-based mean? Elizabeth Short at Harvard University says the definition most aggressively, and there's a misquote there, promoted today, the gold standard holds that approaches to solving social problems should be considered evidence-based only when they have been found to be effective by research methods involving random assignment of participants to experimental and controlled conditions. Robert Sampson, and this was one of the persons that Gondo alluded to, he didn't mention it by name before, past president of the American Psychological Association, however, has a warning. This is criminological experimental randomists have overreached in their claims and generated their own folklores, or what I think are more appropriately referred to as myth. Experimental myths are more than just stories or part of a tradition. They have become actively institutionalized in the routine workings of criminology. Experiments are not the gold standard simply because they are not free-standing. Because there is no free-standing gold standard. Another warning by Elizabeth Shore, also at Harvard again. Even in the field of medicine, which gave randomized clinical trials their heyday, has outgrown their constraints. The Roundtable on Evidence-Based Medicine of the Institute of Medicine called for a re-examination of what constitutes evidence and suggested that randomized clinical trials should not be considered the gold standard. Okay? So this is the Roundtable on Evidence-Based Medicine who come to the conclusion. Okay? So in response to your question then, do scientists agree that evidence-based means that evidence is generated through randomized clinical trial? Obviously then the answer is false. Now, statement 6, do current interventions, current criminal justice interventions, and in particular I'm focusing here of VIPs, but I'd like to speak about it more broadly for a moment. Do not work? That's a statement. How many of you have heard that before? Nothing works. Only 3 people here? No, 4? Okay. All right. So you heard it, right? Now, so a few years back, I reviewed the literature in a very different review from the more rigorous methodological approaches that had to do with meta-analysis. A few years back, when I trained and worked with Mary Strauss, the renowned sociologist and one of the founding figures in the field of domestic violence, I was preparing a talk, and I had all sorts of very fancy statistical analysis. And he said to me, I remember when I was preparing my slide, he said, couldn't you say that with percentages? Because if what you will say in percentages is not that different from what you would say with all these more sophisticated statistical techniques, if it doesn't change the message, people really get it and know a lot more, make more sense of this. They know how to think about proportions much better than effect sizes and this or that. So what I did, I went into the literature and I looked. I wasn't concerned about quality of research, of the methods used. I wasn't looking at that. I wasn't being judgmental. I took everything that had been published on the effectiveness of protective orders, arrest and the participation of men in battery intervention programs, and coordinated community response networks. I went in and I counted, even if they did not report it, I just counted the people that in their data had improved and had not improved, had improved and had not improved. So I just wanted to see, because to me this kind of like gave you a pulse of what was happening in the field. Is it what people do? Is it what is happening in terms of interventions in the criminal justice system? Is it benefiting more people than not? A very basic question in my mind. And what I found was actually all of it, the protective orders, the arrest policies, the participation in the battery intervention programs, those three have some very similar levels of impact, if you will. About 2/3 of the men who were engaged in those actually had lower levels of recidivism than men who were not. Interesting, because then you begin to think systemically, you are not only really looking at BIPs, but we're looking at other components of the system. And then what? You would then think that if you look at a system that includes all these elements, you would hope that the rates of recidivism would be lower, And that's exactly what I found. That the more, almost like a dosage effect, the more of those components were present in the reported studies at the time, the lower the levels of recidivism that were reported by the researchers, okay? Now, I know that the quasi-experimental evaluations were excluded, I believe, from the study, from the meta-analysis, right, that you did? Yeah. Some
studies, but not those that compared computers to drop.
The computers, all right. So thank you for the clarification. I looked at all at the time, all the available data on quasi-experimental studies, and by kind of like the source of the report. So I have, when you look, for example, in studies that were done until that time on using police reports, I found recidivism rates for completers of 18%, an average of 9. But the study, 0 to 18% with an average of 9. And recidivism rates for dropouts of an average of 26%. This is police studies, or police reports. When we looked at victim reports, we found recidivism rates for completers of 32%, and the recidivism rates for dropouts average of 46%. I mean, not surprising that the women victims would report more. Well, what the point that I'm making here is that in both cases, the rates of the recidivism for dropouts were higher in terms of percentage than the rates for recidivism for completers. Okay. So not much more that I can say about Gonda's studies. He talked about it, and Ed talked about it. I do think that is if there's anything that approaches a silver standard on how to do this type of work, it would be, because I don't think that he would like to be called gold standard, but this is the key, as Larry mentioned, the detail, the care and the design, the attention to the importance of getting information from victims as well as from perpetrators, providers, the ability to engage the participants in a research enterprise for as long as they did with the success rate that they did is truly commendable. And but I won't bother you with the findings, since you're already, we have gone through it already. The one that I want to highlight again is this issue about the 20% subgroup who repeatedly reassaulted their partners over the course of the study. He gave us a number of warnings. One is that there were 20% of the men who were repeatedly violent throughout the follow-up process, that the sites that he worked with at the time lack adequate responses to those repeaters. And that's the case today too. That was true then and is true today. That additional protections for the female partners were needed. And there was a need to identify and contain the repeaters through ongoing kind of like risk management procedures. In his book on battery intervention systems, he goes more in detail about what that may look like. So statement 6, battery interventions programs do not work. There is no evidence that men who attend programs do better than those who don't. For me, the answer is clearly mostly false. It is mostly false. The majority of the men who complete participation in battery intervention programs do better in terms of recidivism rates than men who don't. Now, are we really, have we reached the pinnacle of what we can do? Absolutely not. Especially given the fact, as if you remember the context in which we're talking about how the context in which these programs exist. In a society that is filled with a great deals of inequality, with kind of like a governmental responses that are not intentionally addressing many of the causes of these toxic conditions in which people are living, in relationships that are filled with distress, and with a group of folks and programs who are actually have nobody behind them. There's no cheerleaders for battery intervention programs. So what can be done to enhance the effectiveness of interventions with men who batter? We have to recognize the benefits and the limitations of the existing interventions. One thing that I didn't, that was missing from the report that I read, the Washington report when I read it, was there was no acknowledgement that about what may be some of the benefits really that these programs may be bringing in. And so without a clear articulation of that and reference to the work of others documenting this, then it becomes basically tacitly a statement that you should not really be paying attention to this. And I think that is problematic for me. We have to improve our ability to engage the perpetrators of domestic violence in the change process. Why is that? Because when we do engage them, we know the data is there. Those who complete do considerably better than those who don't. So how do we engage them? And this is where I think a lot of these cultural appropriate or culturally sensitive or informed programs have potential to be useful, is because by creating ways and using language and practices that are familiar and affirming to the life of the men that they're working with, they create the conditions for those men to be engaged, to kind of like, in order for you to change any toxic behavior, any behavior of any type, but in particular, things that you are really, behaviors that are shameful to you, that are hurtful to those that you love. In order for you to take the risk to change those behaviors, you need to kind of like feel somewhat safe. You need to feel somewhat connected and somewhat in an environment that really at least affirms some part of your life. And I think is the benefit of some of these programs that deal with cultural, more ethically appropriate, that they really engage the men more better than other programs. One example is the cultural context. There are two examples. One is the Julia Perilla's work on Caminar Latino in Atlanta. And they have, very, very low levels, I would say, of kind of like attrition among the men who go there. But what do they have? They provide services for the men, but in the same facility, in the same area where the men are being provided, what do they have? They have the church, they have services for the women, they have classes for the kids, so everybody's going together to get all sorts of kind of like attention to issues that matter to them in a culturally consistent kind of like way. And perhaps some of your programs here to do the same. And we need to improve offender compliance through judicial review. Very few people have the power that the judges have to really convene, folks to the table, have different providers and different parts of the system really come in and work together in a coordinated community response way, and also follow through with non-compliance. And so we need to really engage the judges aggressively and intentionally and candidly about this. I went I had a conversation like this. In fact, I think the first version of this particular talk I prepared for a group of about 50 judges in Washington State. They called in the National Council on Juvenile Family Court Judges, asked me to go there. I went there. Scott Miller was there from the Duluth Model Training Program. And we had a candid conversation about it. We helped them kind of like contextualize, how we see it. This is what the Duluth model is really about. This is what the Duluth intervention is really about. And their questions were so, after a day of hanging out with them and talking, they were willing to raise their hand and said, I had no idea. I had no idea that it was like that. I mean, I heard about it. I got the study. I read the conclusions. And you know, I have a busy caseload. You know, I have to move on and doing my thing. And I know they have really tough decisions to make, but we need to also really engage them actively, not just give them the pre-digested information. Kind of, we have to engage them actively, understanding the role that they can play and what the research really says in its broad kind of like implications, because otherwise they end up kind of like just following recommendations that I think had the potential to put women at risk. And I think we need to develop appropriate responses to repeaters. I agree with Larry when he said, I don't think the repeaters are really, I don't think there's anything in the way the programs to work with men who are that was designed really to address the multiple needs of those folks who are, I'm described here as repeaters. That 20% may have no place in the programs as we know them today. So other things need to happen to address the needs of these men. As I mentioned before, we need to integrate practices that are consistent with that appreciation of the needs of cultural and ethnic groups. And we need to recalibrate the expectations that we have on battery intervention programs. I don't think that I would put my money there. I would not put my money, speaking directly to the peer, I would not put my money on the programs themselves, because the expectations that we have in the absence of taking a look at the rest of the package are not real. It's a fiction. We think that they should work as well as aspirin, as well, which apparently they do in terms of based on what Larry said, but as well as other interventions on conditions for which we have a lot of control over the factors that are affecting, its effectiveness. But in this case, not. So if we are going to really be putting our money on the evaluation of battery intervention programs, I suggest that we really do it by taking a broader look at those other issues and aggressively trying to address them too, as social policies, to talk about battery intervention programs and coordinated community responses as social policies. Thank you very much. Any
questions?
Yes.
I waited. Thank you for your presentation and for coming out to New Mexico. Hope you enjoy your visit while you're here. So just following up on one of those last points that you were making, there's been lots of experiments and quasi-experiments on social intervention programs and models that have some of the same kinds of issues that batterers intervention programs do. They operate in a larger, more complex social, judicial, and other kinds of arenas, but they've been shown to still affect outcomes. Why should we expect less out of batterers intervention programs? Because I mean, all the early childhood people that I met with earlier this week say the exact same thing that you say, that legislators don't value it, the society doesn't value intervention or prevention programs earlier on, all of those types of same things.
Let me give you a kind of like an answer. As a professor of psychology and a trainer of mental health professionals for 20 years, You know, when I would, and let me backtrack. I have required students that work with me over the year to go and get training to work with men who batter at the sites, you know, to get the training to understand what's happening. But I never, even though I was so close to it, never really found myself in the position to be able to justify sending the students that I had, doctoral students, to go and be training in those conditions, in the basements of churches, hot churches, if you're in New England in the winter, in moldy, you know, mildewy places in other communities. So we have put so little resources really in strengthening that. It's not comparable with the services for children that we have, the services that we have for substance abuse and other areas are in a very different level of development and commitment from our kind of like governing bodies, you know, and so it is, to me, the field of substance abuse is maybe more like in the adolescent stages. You kind of like, we went through a period of time, we kind of like found out what the tantrums were, how to deal with that, and we kind of like can contain it, and now we kind of like seeing that there are actually a number of interventions that are quite effective, that if you work with the family in structured environments, you can do that, and that, you know, so we're beginning to really, we move there. In the domestic violence field, we are in infancy because we haven't really allowed that. The knowledge base was not there to begin with from a scientific point of view. Now, the knowledge that we have, which is the one that we ought to be milking out right now, is what you might call, you know, it's the practice-based kind of like evidence. People who have been working with men who batter for 20 years know a lot about all those systems that are really infused in their lives. They know how to navigate through all those things. They know how to reach out to victim services. They know how to deal with probation. They know how to approach the judge. Now, these programs that and what I would call the providers of services to men who batter are, in a sense, underutilized by the system. They, from my perspective, if I had to bet on a solution that put some money on something that would really be effective, I would turn battery intervention programs into what I have described in other contexts as domestic violence solution networks. I would really have those folks who already are doing that work without support, who are already trying to make it work and coordinate communities. I would really work with them and bring technical assistance and bring them the software and bring in social network analysis and bring academia, and then really out of that create, really amplified on the knowledge that they have in a way that we can more effectively function outside. That's a core group that we have now. There, the soldiers are there. They don't have the marching orders and the support to do it. But anyhow, going back to your question, the issue is that it's not comparable. They're not the services for children. We have been committing to them for a very long time. We have put the resources there, and we're seeing the benefit. With programs for men who batter, we have not. There are no. I mean, one of the main providers of funds for.
So you don't dispute that there's not evidence that the current approach to batter's intervention is shown to have been, that they're effective. I mean, because of the reasons you state, that the programs are underdeveloped, we don't have enough knowledge base to know really what works at a programmatic level, though we may have a lot of knowledge at a practice-based level, resource underutilization, and implementation problems across the country kind of hinder those. So that,
for me, I would reword it from my
strengths-based perspective.
The way I like to talk about that is that they are remarkably effective given the limited resources that we have given them. That they are really with all the constraints that they're operating and the lack of support from the community as well as our agencies that support the development of programs like that. They are, to me, is almost a miracle that they do anything sometimes. I mean,
so that things aren't worse.
That they aren't worse. Yes, to me, sometimes I tell my friends, and I say, I know why. I'm a clinician, and some of these folks are really gifted individuals at what they're doing. They really have learned about the psychology of the aggressors. They really learn about how the systems work. So they kind of like are really very, very talented that way, and they're committed to it. And they go, the curriculum says A, B, and C, but they do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You know, they go all the way out. The curriculum may say nothing and about the need for this person to really have a job, and they go out of their way to try to get that person to get a job, and they do all these things, you know. So it's yeah.
So what?
Can you clarify what system you're comparing it to? Because like I'm
Oh, lots of education. You talk to school folks right now, and they'll say we can't be held responsible for children's outcomes in education because they come from neighborhoods that we're meeting in today. And there's all these other external factors that are more important than what we do. You know, in early childhood, you're living in, you know, lots of those different difficult situations within the family. Juvenile justice, the adult criminal justice system. There's been, you know, lots of other interventions that have been tested in these different environments. But I guess my final kind of question is, what's a reasonable expectation given the maturity level of these types of programs to reduce recidivism, or it's just holding the line of not really being effective is good enough given where we're at?
I'm going to ask you to hold that question and repeat it to me in a moment, because I wanted to say something about this whole bit about education, for example, since I happen to be in that field too. And I refer all of you, if you're interested in the work of Levine or Levine, as you may want to, at Columbia University, who had demonstrated that for each dollar that you put in prevention, the return, you get $7 back. So what we know in education that has worked, I mean, there are a lot of instructional practices that are refined and that you can engage kids differently. There are a lot of things you can do in the room, but really what is the return on the investment is clearly considerably bigger with the prevention initiatives, which address and having the kids coming in, having eaten adequately, being able to pay attention, having really schools that are not where they don't have to really walk through sidewalks filled with all sorts of distractions and threatening experiences before they get into there. And so take a look at that. I'm blanking his first name, and but Levine is his last name at Columbia University, and as well as others. And now, the other, can you repeat? I knew I was going to forget the question. So, and the question was?
I apologize, we've got an emergency at home right now. What's a reasonable expectation
For these programs?
for these programs?
As they currently stand?
Right.
I honestly think that if we, if we do nothing, we should not expect any more than about what you just saw there, 60%, you know, of the folks who complete. I think that's what really would happen. You know, it's kind of like a truism. It probably just will remain that way. If we aggressively provide risk management for those most severe perpetrators or more dangerous folks, if we screen them out, if we kind of like provide the resources for professional training and professional development of those who are working in the field, and provide them appropriate conditions to do their work, my guess, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's going to be, I have no reason to believe that it would be greater than psychotherapy in general. You know, psychotherapy in general works for about like 70% of the people or so. So we probably could increase to similar levels if we do a better job of really assessing well the men that we have and their fitness with the models that we're offering within a coordinated community response initiative. But that's only looking at the program. In terms, and again, I don't want you to lose sight of the battery intervention programs as part of a social intervention, and the need to be committed to at a broader level. That I think to me is the biggest key. I don't know that we have not given ourselves a chance to see what these programs would do if we really support them as part of a social intervention. You know, with the Duluth folks, when they are working, and they do it in Minnesota and other, their data, and for example, it's a recent study that came out from the Emerge program in Massachusetts. It's a new study about the effectiveness. And the Emerge is as mature a program as there is out there. David Adams and folks have been working from the beginning. And the data came out as you would expect for a program that is mature like that. They're pretty good in terms of lower recidivism rates for men who are participating in those programs. That's a study done by somebody, I believe, at Tufts University. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
You know, it's interesting because when I hear,
I think that, like, definitely to Charles's point, that all of these social programs are underfunded to some extent, or to a huge extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all these ills, everything that was on that list that you had that we are really cruising at, they're all underfunded, right? And they all exist on a systematic level, and that's not always a smooth operation, right? But the majority of BIPs are operating designed to be working with the criminal justice system, not separately. And so it's more akin to me, not that we're just complaining about the rest of the system, it's more akin to me to say, like CYFD, child protection is what we call that here. It's saying, okay, you've abused and neglected your children, we're going to remove them and they're going to be in state custody outside of people who are operating like maybe individually. They're really designed to be, they're operating with like court-ordered clients most of the time. And so if that relationship is not there, it's not quite, for me, the same thing to compare that to other systems that aren't working as well, because it's absolutely designed to have that relationship.
With the courts.
Yeah. And so, and the other thing that I'm thinking is, actually it's being advertised here, but there was a messaging conference that we had locally here 2 years ago now. And one of the things that one of the presenters there said is that facts do not change beliefs. And I think that our criminal justice system is designed to look at problems with the individual and punish or hopefully ameliorate problems with the individual. So when we bring up all of these things as far as where the United States is, facts about, you know, how poorly we're doing, those facts, if the value is still that this is a problem with an individual and not about a larger social issue, it seems like it kind of falls flat, you know? And so I'm not sure where the conversation can go from there. I think that we struggle that way.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think, though, that the in part, I mean, a small part perhaps of the solution is intentionally framing the issue as a social policy and being disciplined about it, because the temptation to just demonize and just point to the individual is great, especially because we all know what you just said. We all know that all those other areas are all underserved and underprovided. You know, we're not really doing our job. Our collective failure is affecting a lot of, it's being expressed in a lot of different ways in the health of our people. So I think it's hard if you're a policymaker. It's hard to live with that from day to day if you're trying to do the best that you can, and I mean a lot of what is done moves the needle the needle a little bit, you know, and some of it, but a lot of it ends up being ameliorative. It ends up being to just make people feel better and not necessarily do better, you know, with their lives. And I don't know if that answered that. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and we're having all these discussions, but I'd really like to know, what do we know about our state? How much money is going toward batterers intervention programs? Do we have any information about recidivism? Although I don't think recidivism is really the full picture, and maybe we need to figure out what we know and then figure out what we want to know and decide how we're going to get there. Because this is all pie in the sky right now, and it just seems like, this thing got started, this task force got started because there was some question, but we're not looking at a baseline yet. We have an offender program, and we have them fill out these surveys, and we send that stuff to CYFD every month, and they answer 3 questions, and I see every single form. And one of the questions is, my behavior affects my family. And usually, if they've checked the box that says that they've been in the program 1 to 8 weeks, they say no, not at all. And as they get through the program, then it gets better along the way. And then there's a place for comments at the bottom, and some of the comments are awful. They're like, everything about this disgusts me. They're like, I don't belong here. And then there are these others that are these gems that just knock your socks off. Like, I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm so grateful to be in a program like this that helps me to get better for my family. And I feel like those comments go into some black hole that nobody ever sees. And yet we're here justifying what we're doing. And have you read that? Do you know that stuff?
Okay, I just want to say to you, if I may, that's in part what I said before, without a clearly articulated vision in response to the issue, then we end up blaming the programs themselves for our lack of activity. I can assure you, and I'm speaking for the whole research community, and we go from we're of all colors and a different kind of interest in methodological issues. But I can assure you that if you, in the state of New Mexico, you said, we want to set up a set of benchmarks. This is what we want to go. This is what we want to do. And you want the input of the expert input of the research community, we will give it to you. They will be happy to come and work with you on that. They'll be happy to say, okay, what are the areas of which we know something about that can be used to build a social policy or strengthen the ones that you already have in a ways that can be assessed. I tell you, I have not met an academic in domestic violence or any other area, by the way, who, when you give them an opportunity to make their work relevant to the communities and those who outside academia, does not jump to the opportunity. By and large, they like to sit down there like Larry was doing in his office, but many of them, when even Larry, who's worked a lot in the community, when you bring them out, the challenge, they come out, they do, and so if that was something that you were interested here, I know from the research community, and I mentioned that in passing, part of the reason why I came here was because I think this is very important. And when I hear the Pew getting involved in this, and I want to make sure that it gets done right. I really want to make sure that it gets done right, because it's an opportunity to do it in a way that really could have a significant impact for the nation.
We had some folks, we had a national conference thing here was that Battered Women's Justice Project or something? And it was for probation and parole regarding domestic violence. And we went to this thing, but our probation and parole people didn't come. Well, because they can't get away because they're too dang busy,
right?
But it was embarrassing. It was real embarrassing to have this conference here in New Mexico and have just a handful of probation and parole people there. But I realized, there's other people that need to have some role in this. And in some other states, they actually can do this, and they do make a commitment to probation and parole, to following people through the domestic violence treatment and intervention process. And we don't have that. And, you know, before I was just blaming them, and then I realized, well, they don't have the resources to do this. And so it's, you know, to a certain extent, it's not so much to me a question of, are we wasting our resources with the programs, as are we not putting enough resources in other parts of the system to make sure that it works.
So I appreciate your comments, Kay, and as sort of the direct folks that are overseeing all the domestic violence services to all the populations for this state. For us, we absolutely do, as you know, we do collect the information and look at the information, and for us it is really meaningful because, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that though for everybody. It's also why we have a dedicated person here who's actually overseeing offender services for the state. It's the reason why we're here, the reason why we want to create standards that will provide the most effective services that ultimately will keep the survivors and the children safe. I think that it is sort of that piece of, you know, where do we go from here, and how do we figure out what kind of baseline we want to look at based on all the information that we've been listening to for the last 3 months. And I think there's some themes for me that are coming up around a coordinated response, which does include the judicial system, does include probation, parole, and does include the direct programs. And I think for me, that's kind of trying to figure out, you know, where are we going to go from here. So it doesn't necessarily just go into a black hole. I mean, it's definitely something that we as a domestic violence unit really value and want to see how we can figure out how to make it better. I mean, I think ultimately that's all of our goals, is how to make it better.
Shauna is your?
Shauna.
Shauna, are you with the New Mexico Battery Intervention Task Force, or is this a different office?
Children, Youth, and Families Department.
All right.
DV unit.
Because and this may be relevant for you too, but you reminded me of something that I think, for example, I think that, and I'm shooting from the hip, not knowing exactly how you're organized with the task force, but I think that that all these bodies do well in having a scientific advisory group from the get-go. That you shouldn't, the meta-analysis part of it will be a breeze. You know, if you from the get-go have people involved, kind of like doing things in the right way, assessing them in the right way, kind of like involved in the right way. So that's something. When I mentioned when we started that I spent a lot of the last decade, you know, creating university community partnership with community organizations, basically, and that was one of the winning strategies that we had. Was that we would bring them in the expertise as advisors, and they would write grants with them and things like that. So it's a strategy that you may want to consider.
Thank you. I think we're just about out of time. Is there anyone who has a question that they just can't keep to themselves? That did. Kay is sorry if she offended you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. That was great. Thanks.
So Etiony, if we have a scientific advisory board, will you serve?
Absolutely.
Okay,
and
great.
I'll get you a whole bunch of other people to do that.
I get some other people too. Thank you. Okay.